The sun hung gently above the horizon, scattering golden light across the Santa Monica Pier. Families strolled leisurely with ice cream cones in hand, children clutched balloons from vendors, and the air was filled with the mingling scents of popcorn, ocean breeze, and fried food from nearby stalls. Street performers danced and played instruments, tourists snapped photos against the backdrop of the Ferris wheel, and laughter carried over the wooden planks of the pier. Amid this bustling scene, a young girl in a wheelchair moved carefully through the crowd, her wide eyes soaking in the magic of the place. For her, it was not just another day at the pier. It was an opportunity to be part of the world, to feel normal, to taste the joy others took for granted. Her disability had made her life different, filled with daily challenges, but she had a spirit that longed for freedom, adventure, and moments that made her forget she was limited by her body. She maneuvered slowly, her small hands gripping the wheels as she pushed herself forward. People occasionally glanced at her, some offering smiles, others staring with pity, but she kept her focus on the colorful stalls and the ocean waves crashing in the distance. She wanted to belong in this moment, surrounded by the energy of life. Yet within the crowd, not everyone carried kindness in their hearts. A group of teenagers leaned against the wooden railing, laughing among themselves with an air of arrogance. Their voices were loud enough to draw attention, and their expressions carried the smugness of people who believed the world owed them amusement. They noticed the girl making her way past, and something in her vulnerability caught their eyes. It wasn't empathy they felt. It was the urge to exploit what they perceived as weakness. As she wheeled herself along, one of them stepped forward, blocking her path. She tried to turn slightly to avoid him, but he moved again, smirking as his friends chuckled behind him. He bent down slightly, mocking her effort to push forward, and said with cruel sharpness, "Move, Cripple." The words cut through the cheerful atmosphere like a blade, silencing even some of the laughter nearby. The girl froze, her chest tightening as though all the oxygen had been pulled from the air. She had been called names before, but something about the piercing venom in his tone, the public humiliation in front of strangers, sank deeper than usual. She wanted to shrink into her chair, disappear, become invisible, so she wouldn't have to endure the eyes now fixated on her. Before she could respond, another boy kicked at her wheelchair, making it jolt violently. The sudden motion caused her to gasp, her hands slipping from the wheels as she tried to steady herself. The teenagers laughed louder, pointing at her as if she were an object of entertainment. Tears stung her eyes, but she fought to hold them back, determined not to give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Inside, though, she felt herself crumbling. Every cruel encounter she had endured before seemed to pile up in that single instant. The whispers in classrooms, the stares at malls, the jokes made behind her back. All of it came rushing back with the force of a storm. And now, here, in what was supposed to be a happy place, she was once again reduced to someone's target. The pier, once filled with laughter and carefree voices, now felt suffocating. People nearby had noticed the interaction, but most froze, unsure of how to act. Some looked away, pretending they hadn't seen anything, while others pulled out their phones, recording the incident as though it were a scene in a movie rather than a real child suffering. The girl glanced around desperately, hoping someone would step in, but all she saw were hesitant eyes and silent lips. A lump formed in her throat, making it hard to breathe. She wanted to scream, to tell them to stop, but fear locked her voice inside her chest. The boy who had kicked her leaned closer, sneering. "What's the matter? Can't handle a little bump?" His friends burst into another round of laughter, and one of them mimicked pushing a wheelchair, dragging his feet as though mocking her every movement. She sat frozen, her small hands gripping the arms of her chair, wishing she could push forward, wishing she could roll away, wishing she could simply vanish. Every second felt like an eternity, the humiliation settling on her like a heavy blanket. She could feel strangers' eyes burning into her, and she wondered if this was how the world truly saw her, not as a girl with dreams and hopes, but as an object to be pitied or ridiculed. Her mind screamed questions she couldn't voice. Why me? Why here? Why can't they just let me live like everyone else? She thought about the effort it had taken her just to get here today. The planning, the strength it required to maneuver her chair, the courage to put herself in the middle of a bustling crowd despite knowing she might face stares. And now all of that bravery seemed wasted because of a few cruel words and a kick from someone who didn't know her story, who didn't care to know that behind the wheelchair was a heart that longed for the same joy as everyone else. The laughter from the group echoed in her ears, bouncing against her thoughts until it became unbearable. Her eyes filled with tears she couldn't hold back any longer, and one slipped down her cheek, glistening in the sunlight before disappearing into the fabric of her clothes. She hated that they could see it, hated that they could witness the evidence of her pain. The bullies noticed and laughed harder, proud of their cruelty, proud that they had made someone feel small. The girl's chest ached as she tried to hold herself together. The pier around her carried on with its noise and movement, but in her world, everything had slowed to the rhythm of her heartbeat pounding in her ears. She wanted to scream, to fight back, to tell them they were cowards, but the words refused to leave her lips. Instead, she sat there, trembling in her chair, gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. For her, that moment was not just about a single insult or a cruel kick. It was about the constant reminder that the world often saw her as less. It was about every playground game she was excluded from, every invitation she never received, every stranger who stared at her longer than they should have. These boys had not only insulted her body, but had tried to strip away her dignity. They had turned her humanity into a joke for their amusement. She thought about her parents, how they always told her she was strong, that she should never let others define her. She wanted to believe them, but in that moment, strength felt like an impossible dream. All she could feel was the sharp sting of cruelty and the weight of loneliness. As the bullies laughed and mocked, she wondered if this was what life would always be, one long string of moments where she had to endure insults and humiliation while the world watched in silence. The ocean waves roared beneath the pier, but their sound was drowned by the cruel chorus of laughter above her. For the first time that day, she regretted coming to the pier, regretted putting herself in a place where happiness seemed reserved for others. The colors of the carnival rides, the sweetness of the cotton candy in the air, the rhythm of street musicians, all of it was overshadowed by the heavy darkness that now wrapped around her heart. She wanted to move, to escape, but her path was blocked, not just physically by the boy standing in front of her, but emotionally, by the wall of shame that had been built around her. She lowered her gaze, staring at her hands in her lap, hoping that if she didn't look at them, maybe they would lose interest. But the laughter didn't stop, and their taunts continued to slice through the crowd, reminding her with every word that cruelty often finds its way to the most vulnerable. And in that painful, endless moment on the Santa Monica Pier, she felt utterly alone. A fragile figure in a sea of strangers, caught in the grip of cruelty that threatened to shatter the fragile courage she had brought with her that day. The scene lingered like a shadow across the pier, and what hurt the most for the girl was not only the cruel words or the sharp kick at her chair, but the way the world around her seemed to freeze and then retreat into silence. People had seen it. Eyes had caught the moment, expressions shifted, but action was absent. She could feel the weight of their stares, the awkward shifting of bodies, the way hands hovered near phones instead of reaching out to help. It was as if she had become a spectacle, an unwilling performer in a cruel play, and the audience had decided to sit back rather than intervene. The bullies had stolen her dignity, but the silence of the crowd made her feel abandoned. Around her, families kept their children close, parents whispered in low tones to one another, and some chose to glance briefly before turning their attention elsewhere. The smell of roasting peanuts and saltwater taffy drifted in the air, but it no longer felt sweet. Instead, it seemed suffocating, clinging to her like a reminder that joy belonged to everyone else but her. The sounds of carnival music and laughter continued, but they blended into a distant hum, disconnected from her reality. She noticed someone pulling out their phone, angling it just enough to capture the scene. The bright lens glinted in the sunlight, reflecting back at her like a mirror that trapped her humiliation. It wasn't compassion that fueled these people. It was curiosity, the twisted desire to document another person's suffering, perhaps to share it later for entertainment. She wanted to shout at them, to demand why they stood there doing nothing. She wanted to ask if they could not see she was trembling, that she was just a child trying to live, trying to enjoy the pier like everyone else. Instead, her voice stayed locked in her chest, drowned out by the thundering sound of the boys' cruel laughter. Her hands gripped her wheels tightly, the rubber pressing into her palms, and her whole body felt as if it were shrinking under the invisible weight of the eyes surrounding her. There was a woman nearby who looked torn, clutching her child's hand tightly. The child tugged at her, asking questions, pointing at the bullies, but the woman only shook her head, whispering something about staying out of trouble. A man with a camera around his neck lingered close, frowning but not moving, his fingers twitching as though he considered stepping in but lacked the courage to do so. A group of teenagers stood a little further away, watching and whispering among themselves, some laughing nervously, others looking uneasy. It was a portrait of hesitation, of people caught between morality and fear, and in that hesitation, the girl was left unprotected. She felt invisible and yet exposed at the same time. Invisible because no one was stepping forward to defend her, exposed because everyone was watching. That paradox burned inside her chest, making her feel as if she were unraveling, piece by piece before their eyes. Her mind screamed for someone to say something, for anyone to push the boys back, to remind them that cruelty was not acceptable. But the silence stretched on, interrupted only by the jeering voices of her tormentors. The bullies fed on that silence. Their confidence grew in the absence of resistance. They strutted around her, mocking her movements, leaning down to make faces and tossing words that sliced at her spirit. They knew that no one was going to stop them. They could sense the discomfort of the crowd, but they mistook it for power. And in some ways, they were right. Power lies not just in action, but also in inaction. And the inaction of the crowd gave them all the authority they needed. One of the boys imitated the sound of wheels squeaking, exaggerating every push as though mocking the effort it took for her to move. Another pretended to trip, sprawling dramatically on the pier while laughing, saying that she was in the way. The crowd murmured, a ripple of unease moving through it, but still, no one interfered. The girl's cheeks burned, and she lowered her gaze, staring at the wooden planks beneath her. She wished the boards would open and swallow her whole, carrying her far away from the shame and pain that clung to her like a second skin. The silence of the crowd was not neutral. It was complicit. Each second it stretched on, it confirmed to the girl that people saw her suffering and decided it was easier to do nothing. And that hurt more than the insults themselves. Words could sting, kicks could jolt, but silence left scars that ran deeper. Silence said, "You are not worth the trouble. You are not worth defending." And as those thoughts echoed inside her, her heart ached in ways she had no words for. In her young mind, she wondered what kind of world this was. Was this the world her parents promised her could be kind and compassionate? Was this the same society that spoke about justice and equality? Because right now, it didn't feel like justice existed at all. It felt like cruelty thrived because people allowed it to. She tried to imagine herself in another body, one that could stand, one that could shout, one that could push back. But reality kept her pinned in place, reminding her that she was trapped, powerless against both the bullies and the silence that enveloped her. Her tears threatened to spill again, but she bit her lip, forcing herself to remain as still as possible. If she cried too loudly, it would only entertain the boys more. If she begged, it would only fuel their cruelty. And so she endured, moment by moment, each second heavier than the last. She glanced at the ocean in the distance, its waves rising and crashing endlessly, free and wild. She wished she could be like that, unbound, unstoppable, roaring with power. But here she was, confined to her chair, with her spirit battered by the apathy of strangers. The pier's atmosphere had shifted for her entirely. The music no longer sounded cheerful but mocking. The scents no longer smelled sweet but suffocating. The sunlight no longer felt warm but harsh, spotlighting her humiliation. She wanted to disappear into the shadows, to find a place where no one could see her or hurt her. And yet, she was stuck in the center of attention, not as a person to be celebrated, but as a victim of cruelty. One older man leaned against the railing, shaking his head in disapproval, but he never moved to act. Another woman muttered something about how awful it was, but her words were whispered only to her companion, not spoken aloud in defense of the girl. Even those who disapproved stayed quiet, their discomfort never transforming into courage. And so the silence deepened, pressing against the girl like an invisible cage. In that moment, she learned something about the world that no child should have to learn. That sometimes cruelty is not the loudest voice, but the silence that refuses to answer it. She realized that the absence of kindness was as sharp as the presence of cruelty. And she sat there, surrounded by dozens of people, yet more alone than she had ever felt in her life. The bullies sensed their dominance, circling her like predators who had cornered their prey. Every laugh, every insult, every mocking gesture was amplified by the stillness of those who watched. The girl's heart pounded in her chest, and she fought the rising wave of despair. But even as she trembled, a small part of her held on to hope. Hope that someone would finally break the silence. Hope that somewhere in that crowd, courage still existed, waiting to step forward. But for now, the silence remained unbroken. The air on the pier had grown tense, heavy with the weight of unspoken words and unanswered cruelty. The laughter of the bullies still rang in the girl's ears, each taunt echoing louder because of the silence of those around her. She sat in her chair, her small body trembling, her spirit shrinking, convinced that she was entirely alone in this cruel moment. Her eyes blurred with tears, but through that haze she began to notice something, an unfamiliar sound rumbling beneath the clamor of voices and carnival music. At first it was faint, like distant thunder, rolling low and steady across the boardwalk. Then it grew louder, distinct, a chorus of engines growling in unison. Heads turned as the sound swelled, cutting through the jeers of the boys and the whispers of the crowd. From the entrance of the pier came the sight of motorcycles, large gleaming machines, their chrome catching the afternoon sunlight. One after another they appeared, a steady stream of riders who seemed to arrive with perfect timing, as if summoned by something greater than coincidence. The rumble of their engines drowned out the laughter of the bullies, and the air shifted. The crowd that had stood frozen now parted instinctively, creating a path for the newcomers. People whispered, pointing toward the approaching line of bikes, their presence commanding attention, their unity radiating power. The girl wiped her tears and lifted her head, her eyes widening as she watched them ride closer. She had never seen anything like it, so many riders together, moving as one, their jackets adorned with patches, their faces focused and unreadable. They weren't here for the games or the food or the rides. They had an energy about them, a seriousness that sent ripples of unease through everyone who watched. The bullies who had been so loud and confident moments ago began to falter. Their laughter thinned. Their smirks wavered as the group of bikers slowed their engines and began parking their motorcycles near the pier. One by one, the bikes came to a stop, their kickstands dropping onto the wooden planks. The engines quieted, but the silence they left behind was louder than the noise that had filled the air. Boots thudded against the boards as the riders dismounted, their presence filling the space with unspoken authority. The bullies glanced at each other nervously, their earlier bravado crumbling in the face of something far greater than themselves. These men and women did not need to shout, did not need to raise fists. Their very arrival had shifted the balance of power. The bikers moved with quiet coordination, stepping forward until they surrounded the girl. They did not say a word at first. They simply formed a circle around her, their backs to her wheelchair, their bodies creating an unbreakable barrier. The crowd gasped softly, astonished at the transformation. Where moments before the girl had sat exposed and vulnerable, Now she was shielded by a wall of leather and steel. She was no longer alone. The bullies stood frozen a few feet away, their smirks gone, replaced by wide eyes and stiff postures. One of them opened his mouth as if to speak but found no words. The bikers did not need to issue threats. The fire in their eyes, the calm set of their jaws, and the solidarity of their stance said more than words ever could. The boys had picked a target they thought was weak, but now they were the ones cornered, trapped in the gaze of a dozen riders who would not tolerate cruelty. The girl sat in the center of the circle, her breath catching as she realized what was happening. Relief poured into her chest, mixing with awe. She had never seen anyone stand up for her so strongly, so fearlessly. She looked up at the broad shoulders of the bikers, at the protective shield they created around her, and for the first time that day she felt safe. The tears that had once been born of humiliation now welled up from gratitude. The leader of the group, a tall rider with a bandana across his forehead, stepped forward. He said nothing at first, just stared at the bullies with eyes that seemed to pierce straight through them. His silence was heavier than any shout, and the boys squirmed beneath it. Finally, his voice came, low, steady, filled with authority. He asked them if this was their idea of strength, mocking a child who had done nothing but try to enjoy her day. The words weren't loud, but they carried across the pier like thunder. The crowd, which had been silent before, now murmured approval, their courage returning as they saw what true strength looked like. The bullies shuffled back, their shoulders hunched, no longer laughing. The leader took another step closer, and though he did not touch them, the message was clear. Their cruelty had ended the moment the engines arrived. The boys looked around, realizing there was no escape from the eyes of the crowd and the intimidating presence of the riders. Their earlier power was gone, stripped from them by the unity of strangers who had chosen to stand against injustice. The bikers did not chase them, did not raise fists. They didn't need to. The weight of their silence, the strength in their stance, and the unflinching gaze they cast was enough. One by one, the bullies turned and fled, their sneakers pounding against the boards as they disappeared into the crowd, their bravado shattered. The people who had once stood frozen now clapped quietly, some cheering, their voices timid but growing stronger as they realized what they had just witnessed. Justice, swift and undeniable, had arrived on two wheels. The girl sat stunned, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath shaky but filled with something she hadn't felt before: empowerment. She had been mocked, humiliated, and left alone by the silence of bystanders, but now she was surrounded by protectors who had stepped forward without hesitation. She looked up at them, her lips trembling as if she wanted to say thank you, but the words refused to form. Her gratitude was in her eyes, wide and shimmering with tears. One of the bikers knelt beside her, his face softened by kindness, so different from the hardened expression he had shown the bullies. He asked if she was all right, his voice gentle. She nodded quickly, swallowing the lump in her throat. He reached into his pocket and handed her a small patch from his jacket, telling her it was a symbol of strength, a reminder that she was not weak, that she had more courage than those boys ever would. She held it tightly in her hand, as if it were a treasure. The crowd that had once stood still now moved closer, some offering words of comfort, others apologizing for not stepping in sooner. But it was the bikers who stayed closest, ensuring the girl felt safe. They lifted her spirits not with grand speeches, but with their presence, their actions speaking louder than anything else could. The pier no longer felt like a place of shame. It had become the stage for an extraordinary act of solidarity. The girl breathed deeply, letting the salty air of the ocean fill her lungs. The roar of the waves no longer seemed distant or disconnected. It was in harmony with the roar of the engines, both powerful, both unstoppable. She realized she was not as alone in the world as she had feared. There were people willing to stand for her, people who believed she deserved dignity, people who carried compassion beneath rough exteriors. What had started as one of the darkest moments of her life had transformed into one of the brightest she knew. She would never forget the sound of those engines rolling onto the pier, Never forget the sight of strangers forming a shield around her. Never forget the way fear turned into safety within seconds. The bullies had tried to define her by her chair, by her limitations, but the bikers had reminded her that strength comes in many forms, and sometimes it arrives when you least expect it. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the pier, the bikers remained with her a little longer, making sure she had regained her peace. Children who had once watched in silence now looked at her with admiration, whispering about how brave she was. Parents who had pulled their children away now encouraged them to smile at her, to wave, to offer kindness. The entire atmosphere of the pier had shifted, as though the arrival of the bikers had awakened something dormant in everyone present, a reminder that cruelty should never go unanswered, that silence should never be the only response to injustice. The girl sat taller in her chair, her heart swelling with newfound strength. The humiliation she had felt earlier had not vanished, but it had been overpowered by something stronger, the knowledge that she mattered, that she was worthy of protection, that even strangers would stand up for her. She held the patch tightly, her fingers gripping it like a promise to herself that she would carry this moment forever. The bikers eventually mounted their motorcycles again, their engines rumbling back to life. But before they rode away, the leader gave her a nod of respect, a silent acknowledgement that she was not defined by cruelty but by resilience. The roar of their departure blended with the cheers of the crowd, leaving her with a heart full of gratitude and a memory that would never fade. The pier that only moments before had been a place of cruelty now felt transformed. The bullies were gone, chased not by fists or violence, but by the weight of their own cowardice reflected back at them when true strength stood in their path. The girl sat in her chair, her small fingers still clutching the patch one of the bikers had given her, the faint vibrations of motorcycle engines still humming in the air, even as the sound began to fade into the distance. What had begun as a day filled with humiliation was now something she would never forget, a moment that carried not only the sting of pain, but also the healing touch of compassion. She looked around her, expecting to still see pity in the eyes of the strangers nearby, but what she found instead was a shift so subtle, yet so powerful it brought more tears to her eyes. This time not of sadness, but of relief. The people who had once stood frozen, afraid to step in, were now moving closer. A woman who had held her child tightly before now crouched down to the girl's level, gently asking if she was all right. The girl nodded softly, her voice still caught in her throat, but the kindness in the woman's eyes gave her the reassurance she had been longing for. Another man who had been recording on his phone lowered it, his face flushed with shame as he realized how his silence had added to her suffering. He bent slightly and apologized, telling her she should never have had to face such cruelty. His words could not erase what had happened, but they were a beginning, an acknowledgement that silence had been wrong. The bikers who still stood near her exchanged glances, their tough exteriors softening as they leaned closer, offering her encouragement. One of them handed her a bottled water, another patted her shoulder gently. She could feel the warmth in their gestures, a stark contrast to the coldness of the boys who had mocked her. It was as if the pier itself had shifted from a place of isolation to a sanctuary of unexpected unity. The circle that had once been a wall of protection now began to dissolve, and in its place came an openness, a space where kindness flowed freely. The girl took a deep breath and allowed herself to truly look at the crowd. For the first time since the cruelty began, she did not feel small, she did not feel invisible. The people were no longer staring at her with pity or indifference, but with admiration, with respect for the way she had endured. A child walked up shyly, holding a small balloon in his hand. Without saying a word, he extended it to her. She hesitated, then accepted it, her lips curving into the faintest smile. That small act carried more weight than the boy could have known. It was not just a balloon, but a gift of solidarity, a reminder that compassion could exist even in the youngest hearts. The bikers began to speak quietly among themselves, some shaking their heads in disgust at the cruelty they had witnessed, others muttering that no one should ever have to face such treatment. The leader, who had spoken to the bullies with such authority, turned back to the girl. He crouched down so that his eyes met hers directly. His voice, though still deep and commanding, carried a gentleness now. He told her she was brave, braver than many adults they had seen. He reminded her that strength was not about standing tall or walking without difficulty. It was about enduring pain with dignity and refusing to let cruelty define who you are. The words sank deep into her heart, planting seeds of confidence that she had not felt before. The crowd began to cheer softly, not a loud, raucous applause, but a steady clapping of hands that grew into something powerful. It wasn't just for the bikers. It was for her. For the girl who had faced humiliation and had not broken, for the child who had shown more resilience than the boys who had tried to tear her down. That sound filled her ears, mingling with the fading echo of engines, creating a harmony she knew she would remember for the rest of her life. She felt herself sitting taller in her chair, no longer trying to shrink into invisibility. The weight that had pressed her down minutes ago began to lift, replaced by a sense of pride. For so long she had wished to be seen not as someone fragile, but as someone strong. And now, here she was, in the center of a pier filled with strangers, finally seen for who she truly was. The sting of cruelty was still there, but it was overshadowed by the wave of kindness that had risen in its place. The bullies who had fled would never know the transformation they had inadvertently sparked. They had tried to break her spirit, but instead they had revealed the strength of unity, the power of strangers coming together, the beauty of compassion that could outshine even the darkest of moments. And in that revelation, the girl discovered something within herself, a resilience she had not realized she carried, a courage that had been hidden beneath years of stares and whispers and cruel words. The bikers began preparing to leave, their duty fulfilled, but before they did, the leader leaned close to her once more. He told her that whenever she felt alone, she should remember the sound of engines roaring in unison, remember the circle of protection that had surrounded her, remember that she mattered. She nodded, clutching the patch tighter in her hand, silently promising herself that she would never forget. When the bikers finally mounted their motorcycles again, the sound of their engines rose like a victorious anthem. The crowd stepped aside once more, but this time not in fear or hesitation, it was in respect. As the riders departed, the girl felt her heart swell with gratitude so strong it made her chest ache. She waved faintly, and though they did not look back, she knew they felt it. The pier slowly returned to its usual rhythm, the music, the laughter, the smells of food wafting through the air. But for the girl, nothing was the same. What had started as a day of shame had become a lesson, a memory, a turning point. She knew that life would not suddenly become easy, that there would still be bullies, still be people who looked at her chair before they looked at her face. But now she also knew that there would be people willing to stand by her, even strangers, even those who seemed rough on the outside but carried hearts filled with loyalty and kindness. She realized that strength does not always wear the face of the powerful. Sometimes it comes in leather jackets and roaring engines. Sometimes it comes in the quiet hand of a child offering a balloon. Sometimes it comes in her own determination to hold her head high despite the weight of the world. And as she sat there, watching the sun sink lower into the ocean, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink, she felt a peace she had not known in a long time. The memory of the cruelty still lingered, but it no longer defined her. Instead, what defined her now was the way the story ended. Not with humiliation, but with triumph. Not with loneliness, but with solidarity. Not with silence, but with a sea of voices and engines, reminding her that she was never truly alone. That truth sank deep into her heart, and she knew she would carry it forever. A shield stronger than any insult, a light brighter than any shadow. The Santa Monica Pier continued to buzz with life, but within her, something had shifted permanently. She no longer felt like an outsider looking in. She felt part of something bigger, part of a world where kindness could still win, part of a story where she was not just a victim but a survivor. And in that moment, As the ocean waves crashed endlessly beneath the pier, she whispered to herself a quiet promise that she would never again doubt her worth, that she would hold on to this moment of justice and kindness, and that she would always remember the sea of bikers who turned her darkest hour into a testament of hope.